Some of you have been carrying the weight of worry, tossing and turning at night, wondering, how am I going to make it? How will I provide for my family? How will I get through this season? But I came to remind you today of a promise. God will provide. Not might, not sometimes, but will. And when God says he will, there is no power in hell that can stop it. When people hear the phrase God will provide, their minds often go straight to financial breakthroughs, career opportunities, or material blessings. And while God absolutely provides in those ways, his provision is far greater than just money, houses, or jobs. If we limit his provision to material things, we miss the depth of what it truly means for God to provide. He is not just concerned about your bank account, he is concerned about your entire being. He is the God who supplies every need, not just the ones we can see or touch. Think about it. There are people with millions in their accounts but no peace in their hearts. They have every material possession they could ever want, yet they struggle with anxiety, depression, and a deep void they cannot fill. That's because provision is more than just physical wealth. True provision is when God steps into the unseen areas of your life and provides what no paycheck, no promotion, no house or car ever could. He provides wisdom when you don't know what to do. He provides peace when your world is shaking. He provides strength when you're too weak to stand. He provides direction when you're lost and confused. Sometimes God's provision doesn't come in the form of something we can hold. It comes in the form of protection from what we never saw coming. How many times has God provided for you by closing a door that you wanted to walk through? How many times did he block a relationship that you thought was right for you, only for you to realize later that it would have destroyed you? See, provision is not just about giving you something, it's also about keeping you from something. God's provision is often unseen, but that doesn't make it any less real. Look at how God provided for Elijah in the wilderness. He was isolated, discouraged, and running for his life, yet God sent ravens to feed him. That wasn't just about food, it was about sustaining him in a season where he felt abandoned. Some of you are in a place right now where you don't see the abundance you expected, but can I tell you something? If you still here, that means God has been providing. You may not have everything you want, but you have everything you need to keep going. And sometimes the greatest provision God gives us is his presence. When Moses was leading Israel and didn't know how to move forward, he said, Lord, if your presence doesn't go with us, don't send us. He understood that the presence of God is the greatest provision of all. Because when God is with you, everything else will come. He provides in ways you never expected, through people you never imagined, and in moments you never saw coming. So when you say God will provide, don't just look for the money, the job, or the house. Look for his peace, look for his wisdom, look for his strength, because his provision is not just material, it is everything you need exactly when you need it. We live in a world that thrives on instant results. We want things quickly, efficiently, and on our schedule. But God doesn't operate on human timelines. His ways are higher, his thoughts are greater, and his timing is perfect, even when it doesn't align with our expectations. The challenge is that while we are focused on when something will happen, God is focused on who we are becoming in the process. There are moments in life when we feel like we are waiting forever. We pray, we fast, we believe, but nothing seems to change. We wonder, God, did you hear me? Do you see what I'm going through? Why haven't you stepped in yet? And in those moments, the silence of God can feel overwhelming. But just because he is silent doesn't mean he is absent. Sometimes God delays things not to deny us, but to develop us. There are things we are asking for that we are not yet prepared to receive. There are blessings that, if given too soon, could become burdens because we lack the maturity, wisdom, or character to handle them. Look at the story of Joseph. God gave him a dream of leadership and influence, but he didn't step into that promise overnight. Instead, he went through betrayal, slavery, false accusations, and prison before he ever saw the fulfillment of what God had spoken. If Joseph had received the position before enduring the process, he wouldn't have had the wisdom to manage it well. But through the waiting, through the pain, through the seasons where it seemed like nothing was happening, God was preparing him. By the time Joseph's moment came, he was ready to walk in it. God is not just interested in giving us blessings, he's interested in making sure we can sustain them. A tree doesn't bear fruit the moment the seed is planted. There is a process of growth that takes place underground in a hidden place before the evidence of life ever appears. The same is true for us. There are things God is growing in us beneath the surface, strengthening our faith, building our endurance, stretching our patience, so that when the time comes, we are fully equipped for what he has in store. The problem is we often mistake delays for denials. We think that because something hasn't happened yet, it won't happen at all. But God is a master strategist. He sees what we cannot see. He knows what we do not know. He understands the right moment, the right connection, and the right season. What looks like a delay to us is often divine protection. What feels like a setback is actually a setup. So when things don't happen according to our schedule, we must remember that God is never late. He is never early. He moves at the exact moment that will bring the greatest impact. And when his time comes, no force in heaven, earth, or hell can stop it. Keep trusting, keep believing, because when God moves, he moves in perfection. Faith is the key that unlocks the door to God's provision. It is not enough to simply hope for God to provide. You must believe that he will. Throughout Scripture, we see a consistent pattern. Whenever people trusted God fully, he responded with supernatural provision. Faith is the currency of the kingdom, the bridge between your need and God's supply. Without faith, you are simply waiting on provision, but with faith, you are expecting it. Look at Abraham, the father of faith. God told him to take his son Isaac, the very promise he had waited for, and offer him as a sacrifice. That command didn't make sense. It seemed like a contradiction. Why would God give him a son only to take him away? But Abraham didn't argue, didn't hesitate. He moved in obedience because he trusted that God would provide. He even told his servants, "We will return," before climbing the mountain, fully believing that even if God had to raise Isaac from the dead, he would. And at the moment of greatest need, when the knife was raised, God provided a ram in the thicket. The provision wasn't seen until Abraham moved in faith. That's how God works. He doesn't always show you everything up front. He requires you to walk before you see. Some people say, "I'll believe it when I see it," but in the kingdom you see it because you believe it. Faith activates the provision that is already in place. When God instructed the widow in Zarephath to feed the prophet Elijah, she only had enough flour and oil to make one last meal. In the natural, it made no sense to give away what little she had left. But when she acted in faith, the oil never ran dry and the flour never ran out. Her provision was tied to her obedience, but her obedience was tied to her faith. So often we are waiting on God, but the truth is God is waiting on us. We want him to provide before we move, but he wants us to move before he provides. It is in the stepping out, the trusting, the believing that provision is activated. When Peter saw Jesus walking on water, he said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come." Jesus didn't carry Peter out onto the water. Peter had to step out on his own. And as long as his faith was strong, he walked on what should have drowned him. Faith is not about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who does. It's about believing that even when you don't see the provision, it's already there. God has already placed the ram in the thicket, already filled the jar with oil, already set the path before you. But you will never experience it if you don't step out in faith. Faith isn't just believing that God can provide, it's knowing that he will. And when you believe that, when you truly walk in that confidence, you will see provision manifest in ways you never imagined. Obedience is the key that unlocks the fullness of God's provision. Many people want the blessing, but they resist the instruction that comes with it. They pray for breakthroughs, but hesitate when God gives them a command that requires faith and sacrifice. The truth is, God's provision is often tied to our willingness to obey, even when we don't understand, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it stretches us beyond our comfort zone. Look at the story of the widow at Zarephath. She was preparing to eat her last meal with her son when the prophet Elijah showed up and asked her to make him something to eat first. That request seemed unreasonable. How could she give when she barely had enough for herself? But in that moment, her obedience was the gateway to her provision. She trusted the word of the prophet, and because she obeyed, her flour and oil never ran out. If she had held on to what little she had, she would have missed the miraculous supply that God had already set in motion. Obedience requires trust. It requires believing that God knows what he's doing, even when it doesn't align with our logic. Naaman, a commander in the Syrian army, was desperate to be healed of leprosy. When the prophet Elisha told him to dip in the Jordan River 7 times, he almost walked away in frustration. He expected a dramatic moment of healing, not a simple instruction that seemed beneath him. But when he humbled himself and obeyed, his skin was completely restored. His provision was already waiting for him, but he had to submit to God's way of receiving it. So many people struggle because they want God to provide on their terms. They want the promotion but refuse to be faithful in the current position. They want financial breakthrough but resist God's principles of giving and stewardship. They want relationships to be restored but ignore God's call to forgive. Provision is not just about what God does, it's about what we are willing to do in response to his leading. When God told Joshua and the Israelites to march around Jericho, they had to obey before they saw the walls fall. When Jesus told Peter to cast his net after a long night of failure, Peter had to obey before he saw the miraculous catch. Provision is often on the other side of obedience. Sometimes obedience is difficult because it requires stepping out in faith before we see the result. God told Abraham to leave his homeland, his comfort, his security, and step into the unknown. Abraham didn't have a full roadmap, he had a promise. And because he obeyed, God not only provided for him, but made him the father of nations. When God gives a command, it is always for our good. Even when it requires sacrifice, even when it tests our faith, obedience positions us for provision in ways we could never orchestrate on our own. When we walk in alignment with his will, we will see his hand move in ways beyond our imagination. The wilderness is a place of testing, refining, and preparation. It is not comfortable, it is not easy, and it is rarely where we want to be. Yet it is in the wilderness that God teaches us how to trust him completely. The wilderness strips away distractions, removes false securities, and exposes what is truly in our hearts. It is the place where faith is tested and where we learn that God alone is our provider, our sustainer, and our source. When the Israelites were delivered from Egypt, they did not go straight into the promised land. Instead, they spent 40 years in the wilderness. Why? Because God had to teach them to trust him before he could take them into their blessing. They had been slaves for generations, and although they had been physically freed, their mindset was still bound in Egypt. They depended on their slave masters for food, shelter, and provision. In the wilderness, they had to learn to depend solely on God. He provided manna from heaven, water from a rock, and guided them with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. Every step of the way, he was showing them that he could be trusted. The wilderness is not a place of punishment, it is a place of preparation. It is where God develops us so that we can handle the blessings he has in store. Many people want the promised land without the process. But if you receive a blessing before you're ready, it can destroy you. The wilderness teaches us patience, endurance, and faith. It removes pride and self-sufficiency, forcing us to rely on God in ways we never have before. Look at Jesus. Before he began his public ministry, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. For 40 days, he fasted, prayed, and faced temptation. Why? Because the wilderness was preparing him for what was coming next. If Jesus had to go through a wilderness season, how much more do we? The enemy came to tempt him, just like he tries to tempt us when we feel weak. But in that moment, Jesus didn't rely on his own strength. He relied on the word of God. That is what the wilderness teaches us. To trust in what God has said, not in what we feel or see. Some of the greatest lessons of faith are learned in seasons of lack, uncertainty, and waiting. When everything is going well, it is easy to say we trust God. But when we are in the wilderness, when the job is gone, when the relationship ends, when the plan falls apart, that is where trust is proven. It is in the wilderness that we learn God is still faithful, still present, and still able to make a way when there is no way. The wilderness may feel like a place of struggle, but it is actually a place of transformation. And when we embrace it, when we trust him in it, we come out stronger, wiser, and more ready for the promises he has waiting for us. It's not just about what he gives. It is a reflection of who he is. He does not provide because he is obligated to. He provides because it is his nature to do so. From the very beginning, God has revealed himself as a provider. Before he even created humanity, he prepared the earth with everything necessary for survival: light, water, food, and dominion over creation. Before Adam ever took his first breath, God had already provided everything he would need. That is the kind of God we serve. He moves ahead of us, preparing what we need before we even realize we need it. When Abraham was called to sacrifice his son Isaac, he obeyed, trusting that God would provide. And at the very moment when it seemed there was no way out, God revealed a ram caught in the thicket. Abraham called that place Jehovah Jireh, meaning the Lord will provide. This was not just about God supplying a need, it was about God revealing his nature. He is not just a provider, he is the provider, is who he is. God's provision is not limited to material things. He provides peace in the storm, strength in weakness, wisdom in confusion, and grace in our failures. Every time he supplies a need, he is demonstrating his faithfulness. When the Israelites wandered in the wilderness, he provided manna daily, not because they earned it, but because he is faithful. He made water flow from a rock, kept their clothes from wearing out, and guided them with his presence. Why? Because provision is not just about meeting needs, it is about revealing his heart. Jesus came as the ultimate expression of God's provision. Humanity was lost in sin, unable to save itself, yet God provided a way through his Son. Jesus is the bread of life, the living water, the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. Every miracle he performed, feeding the 5,000, healing the sick, raising the dead, was a demonstration of God's character. He provides not just because we ask, but because it is who he is. God's provision is always wrapped in purpose. He does not bless randomly. He provides exactly what is needed at the right time. When Elijah was in hiding, God sent ravens to feed him. When Peter needed a way to pay his taxes, Jesus told him to find a coin in the mouth of a fish. These moments show us that God's provision is creative, intentional, and specific. He does not just throw blessings our way. He provides in ways that remind us of his sovereignty and love. When we understand that provision is a reflection of his character, we stop doubting and start trusting. We stop seeing provision as something we must chase, and we begin to rest in the assurance that God will always take care of his children. Because provision is not just about what God does, it is about who he is.